My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old. In the morning I found out my sister had been running a competing business under my tax ID for 14 months. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. I was sitting in a beige government-issue chair across from an IRS auditor named Agent Caldwell, watching him slide a manila folder across the table with the words, "Unreported revenue, 200 in Town, 400 printed in plain black ink at the top." He thought I was the fraudster. I had received 17 missed calls from the IRS over the past 3 weeks. I assumed it was a clerical error, a mismatched form, a transposed digit, something small. I run a clean business. I have always run a clean business. The name on the flagged account? Brooks Home & Co. I had never heard of it in my life. Before I tell you what happened next, drop your city in the comments right now. Just your city and what time it is where you are. I need to know who's sitting with me for this one, to understand why that folder nearly destroyed me, not just financially, but in a way that goes much deeper than money. You need to understand how Danielle and I grew up. We were raised in a 2-bedroom house in Cedar Park, just outside Austin. My father worked logistics for a regional freight company. My mother did bookkeeping part-time from the kitchen table. We were not poor, but we were precise. Every dollar had a destination. Every purchase required a reason. I absorbed that early. Danielle did not, from the time she was 7 years old. Danny was the one my parents pointed to when relatives asked how the family was doing. She had the smile. She had the energy. She walked into a room and people noticed. I was the one who cleaned up after the room emptied. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's the factual architecture of everything that came later. By the time I was in high school, I was the one reminding my mother which bills were due. I built a simple spreadsheet, color-coded, categorized, on a second-hand laptop my father brought home from a freight yard office clean-out. I was 16. I thought everyone did this. I later learned that in our house, only I did this. Danielle was in dance recitals. Danielle needed new shoes for the recital. Danielle's coach said she had real potential. I worked a weekend shift at a home goods store on Palmer Lane and put half my paycheck into the household account without being asked. I want to be precise here. Because I am always precise, I did not resent Danny for being loved. I resented the architecture, the invisible assumption that I would hold things together while she was given the grace to fall apart and be caught. That is a different kind of resentment. It is quieter. It lasts longer. I studied interior design and business administration at UT Austin on a partial merit scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. I graduated with a 3087 GPA and approximately $4,200 in my savings account. The week after graduation, my mother called to tell me Danny had dropped out of her community college program, her second program in 3 years, and could I please not make a big deal about it at Sunday dinner. I said, of course. I spent the next 4 years working for a mid-sized commercial design firm in downtown Austin, learning the back end of the industry, vendor negotiations, material sourcing, project management software, client relationship cycles. I was promoted twice. I was also, during this same period, quietly covering $600 a month of my parents' mortgage after my father's company downsized and his hours were cut. Nobody asked me to. Nobody thanked me. It was simply understood in the wordless language of our family that Natalie handles it. In the spring of my 28th year, I left the firm, withdrew $12,000 from my personal savings, signed a lease on a 900-square-foot space on South Congress Avenue, and opened Brooks Atelier. The concept was specific. Japandi-influenced home furnishings, the intersection of Japanese minimalism and Scandinavian functionality, paired with a boutique interior consultation service for residential and small commercial clients. I built a website myself. I photographed the first inventory myself. I answered every email myself at 11 p.m. after closing. Within 18 months, Brooks Atelier had a 4.8-star Google rating across 340 reviews. Within 3 years, I had signed B2B contracts with 3 boutique hotels in the Austin metro area. I had 2 part-time employees, a reliable vendor network built over hundreds of hours of relationship management, and a net margin I was genuinely proud of. And then Danny called and said she wanted to learn the business. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Hope. Real embarrassing hope. I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the version of my sister I always wanted. The one who shows up. I said yes immediately. For 3 months I trained her myself. I showed her how to navigate the POS system. We used Square for retail, integrated with the custom inventory tracker I had built in Airtable. I walked her through our vendor portal, introduced her by name to our 2 primary suppliers at a trade show in Dallas. I showed her how to read a margin report. I explained our reorder thresholds, our seasonal buying calendar, our return policy logic. She was attentive. She asked good questions. She took notes on her phone. 8 months later, she told me the commute was too much and she needed a break. My mother called the following week and said I should be more understanding. Danny was going through something. I said, of course. I sent her $8,500 3 weeks after that because she said she found an online design certification program and just needed a bridge loan to cover the enrollment fee and first month's rent in her new apartment. I transferred the money the same afternoon. I did not ask for a repayment timeline. I told myself that was generosity. She dropped the program after 11 days. I found that out later, much later, when everything else came out. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing, was that 6 weeks after she left Brooks' atelier, Danielle Brooks had walked into the Travis County Clerk's office and registered a new business entity using my employer identification number. She named it Brooks Home & Co. She listed my parents' address in Cedar Park as the business address. She used the vendor contacts I had introduced her to in Dallas. She priced her inventory 15% below mine and opened her doors 8 miles away. For 14 months, she operated. For 14 months, she collected revenue. For 14 months, she filed nothing. And for 14 months, I had no idea she existed. Agent Caldwell gave me exactly 48 hours to respond to the audit notice before the case moved to the next stage of review. He was not unkind about it. He slid a second sheet across the table, a transaction summary, line by line, and told me I was welcome to bring legal representation to the follow-up meeting. I looked at the sheet. The transactions were dated across 14 months. The revenue figures were real. Someone had genuinely been selling furniture, processing payments, running a business. The EIN at the top of every single page was mine. My hands were cold. The fluorescent light above me buzzed at a frequency I will never forget. I asked Agent Caldwell one question. What was the registered business address? He told me. Cedar Park, my parents' house. I drove there directly from the IRS office. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of flat gray Texas day that feels like the sky has simply given up. I pulled into the driveway I had pulled into 1,000 times before and sat in my car for 4 minutes before going inside. Danny was there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and when she saw my face, she closed the laptop slowly, the way you close something when you already know what's coming. I laid the transaction summary on the table between us. I said, "Tell me about Brooks Home & Co." What followed was not an argument. It was something worse, a negotiation. Danny looked at the papers for a long moment, then looked up at me and said with genuine composure, "You were hoarding all the connections. I just used what was technically available." Technically available. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. My tax ID, my vendor relationships, my 14 years of industry credibility. Technically available. She continued. She said she had simply applied what I taught her. She said the market was big enough for both of us. She said I had a head start, and she was just leveling the playing field. Every sentence came out smooth and practiced, like she had rehearsed this conversation in the mirror, like she had been waiting for it. And then my mother walked in from the hallway. She had been listening. I could tell from the way she positioned herself, not between us, but beside Danny, slightly behind her left shoulder. A formation I recognized from every difficult conversation of my entire childhood. She said, "Natalie, she's family. You have more than enough. Why are you being so selfish?" There it was, the word that had been used against me my entire life like a skeleton key. Selfish. Every time I had a boundary, it was selfish. Every time I kept something for myself, it was selfish. Every time I asked to be treated as something other than the family's silent infrastructure, it was selfish. My father appeared in the doorway a moment later. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his arms crossed, and I understood from his posture that he had already decided whose side he was on before I arrived. Danny leaned forward then. Her voice dropped, softened, shifted into the register she used when she wanted something. She said, "It's just paperwork, Nat. We can fix the filing. You just have to tell the IRS we were operating jointly. It's one form. Nobody gets hurt. One form." She wanted me to claim joint operation of a business I had never seen, never touched, never agreed to. A business that had generated $218 in revenue that she had collected entirely herself and spent entirely herself. And she wanted me to absorb the tax liability for all of it and call it a paperwork fix. I looked at her across the table. I looked at my mother standing behind her. I looked at my father in the doorway. I felt the cold in my hands travel slowly up to my elbows. I picked up the transaction summary. I folded it once, cleanly along the center crease. I put it in my bag. I said, "I'll be in touch." I walked out of that house, got into my car, and drove home without the radio on. The whole way back, I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I simply drove and thought, and by the time I pulled into my parking spot, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not what I wanted to do, what I was going to do. There is a difference, and that difference was about to cost Danielle Brooks everything. I got home at 6:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone when I walked through the door. Not for messages, but because I wanted a timestamp. I was already thinking like that. Already collecting. I did not eat dinner. I sat at my desk, the same desk where I had built Brooks Atelier from a spreadsheet and a savings account, and I opened a fresh document. At the top I typed 3 words, "What I know," and I started writing. I wrote down every date I could recall, every conversation, every transfer, the $8,500 I had sent Danny in the spring, the 3 months of training, the trade show in Dallas where I had personally introduced her to our vendors by name, the day she told me the commute was too much. I wrote it all down in plain sequential language, the way I would write a project brief. No emotion, just facts and chronology. By 9 p.m. I had 4 pages. At 9:15 I called Marcus Webb. Marcus is a tax attorney I had been referred to 2 years earlier when I was structuring a contract with one of the boutique hotels. We had worked together once, briefly, and I had kept his number because he was the kind of person who answered questions directly and did not bill you for the privilege of being vague. When he picked up and I told him what had happened, there was a pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. And then he said, "Don't touch anything. Don't call the IRS back yet. Come in tomorrow morning at 8. I was there at 7:52. Over the next 72 hours, Marcus and I built what he called a declaration of separate business operations, a notarized document establishing with timestamp evidence that Brooks Atelier and Brooks Home & Co. were entirely distinct entities, that I had no knowledge of or involvement in the latter's formation or operation, and that my EIN had been used without my authorization. To support that declaration, I pulled everything. I exported the full transaction history from my QuickBooks Online account going back to the day I opened Brooks Atelier, every invoice, every vendor payment, every payroll entry, color-coded and categorized. I printed the original EIN registration certificate issued in my name, dated 6 years prior. I pulled the lease agreement for my South Congress location, the B2B hotel contracts with their countersignatures, the vendor agreements with my signature and my signature only. That I went further. I had trained Danny using our internal systems. That meant there was a paper trail. I retrieved the email thread from when I had set up her temporary staff access to our Airtable inventory system, timestamped, with her personal email address as the recipient. I found the swear for retail login record showing her access was granted and then manually revoked when she left. I had the trade show registration from Dallas, with both our names on the attendee list, which confirmed she had been present as a guest of Brooks Atelier, not as an independent operator. Marcus looked at the stack of documents and said, "This is unusually clean." I told him I had always run a clean business. While Marcus handled the legal filing, I handled the operational side quietly and without announcement. I logged into our shared vendor portal, the same one I had set up for Danny during her training period, the one she had apparently continued using to source inventory for Brooks Home & Co., and I revoked her access. No message. No explanation. One click. I changed the administrative password on the Square account she had briefly been added to as a secondary user. I checked whether her email address had any remaining access to our Airtable base. It did, a read-only link I had forgotten to expire. I expired it. Then I did something that felt small but wasn't. I called our two primary vendors, the ones she had met in Dallas, the ones she had been ordering from under a business name that sounded enough like mine to cause confusion. I did not tell them what had happened. I simply confirmed our account standing, reminded them that authorized orders from Brooks Atelier would always come from my business email, and asked them to flag any orders from unverified contacts using similar branding. Both of them said they had noticed something odd. One of them, a supplier out of Portland I had worked with for 4 years, said a new account had placed 3 orders in the past month under a name that looked like mine. He had assumed it was a secondary account I had opened. I thanked him. I told him it was not. I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Outside my apartment window, Austin was doing what Austin does in October. Warm enough to be confused for summer. Cool enough at the edges to remind you that things are changing. I thought about Danny, not with anger, with something closer to grief. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about being betrayed by someone you love. The anger is easy. The anger is clean. It is the grief that hollows you out. The grief for the version of the person you kept believing in, long after the evidence told you to stop. I let myself feel that for exactly one evening. Then I closed the document, set my alarm for 6 a.m., and went to sleep. The follow-up meeting with Agent Caldwell was in 5 days. I was ready. 3 days before my follow-up meeting with Agent Caldwell, my mother called. She did not open with hello. She opened with, "Your father and I want everyone to sit down together. Sunday dinner, just family." I knew what Sunday dinner meant. Sunday dinner in our house had never just been Sunday dinner. It was a stage, a managed environment where the lighting was warm and the food was familiar, and you were supposed to feel too comfortable to say the hard thing out loud. I said I would be there. I want to be honest about why I said yes. It was not because I thought it would resolve anything. It was because I wanted to see exactly how far they would take this. I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to watch. I arrived at 5:30. The house smelled like pot roast, and the vanilla candle my mother kept on the mantel, the same one she had burned every Sunday for as long as I could remember. My Aunt Linda was there, Uncle Raymond, 2 cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas, and Danny, already seated at the table, already animated, already performing. She was telling a story about expanding. I stood in the doorway of the dining room and listened. She was telling Uncle Raymond about a second location she was considering, something in the Domain, Austin's upscale retail corridor. She used words like scaling and brand identity and customer acquisition. She spoke with the fluency of someone who had absorbed 3 months of real business training and was now wearing it like a costume. Uncle Raymond was nodding. He said, "That's incredible, Danny. Your own stores. You always had that entrepreneurial spirit." I sat down at the far end of the table. My mother brought out the food. My father poured water. The conversation moved around the table the way it always had. Light, looping, carefully avoiding anything with edges. I helped myself to the pot roast. I refilled my own glass. I answered the questions directed at me. Yes, the shop is doing well. Yes, still on South Congress. Thank you for asking. Danny did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. Then Uncle Raymond turned to me with the particular warmth of a man who thinks he is helping and said, "Claire tells me you two are actually in the same business. How does that work? Do you collaborate?" The table went slightly quiet, not silent, just slightly, noticeably quieter, the way a room sounds when several people simultaneously decide not to speak. I took a sip of water. I said, "We don't collaborate. We have separate operations." Danny laughed, a small practiced laugh, and said, "Natalie has always been protective of her business. I totally respect that." She looked around the table as she said it, making contact with each face, collecting sympathy like receipts. My Aunt Linda said, "It must be nice, though, having family in the same industry. Built-in support system." I smiled. I did not correct her. What nobody at that table knew. What Danny did not know, what my parents did not know, what not one person in that warm, vanilla-scented dining room knew, was that 41 hours earlier, Marcus Webb had hand-delivered a complete evidentiary package to the IRS Austin field office. The declaration of separate business operations, notarized and indexed, the QuickBooks export, the EIN certificate, the vendor correspondence, the time-stamped training records showing Danny's access history. Every page numbered, every exhibit labeled. Agent Caldwell had signed the receipt himself. The follow-up meeting was in 2 days. Danny reached across the table for the breadbasket and said almost casually, almost kindly the way you say something you've been planning to say for a while, "Nat, I've been thinking, if you just talk to the IRS and explain that we had an informal arrangement, this whole thing goes away. You wouldn't even have to be involved going forward. I'll handle everything from here." The table went quiet again. Fuller this time. My father looked at his plate. My mother looked at me. Uncle Raymond looked at Danny. My Aunt Linda looked at her hands. I set down my fork. I looked at Danny. Really looked at her the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years past, the performance and the charm and the practiced composure, all the way down to the part of her that had always known exactly what she was doing to me and had simply decided it was acceptable. I said, "I appreciate you thinking about it, Danny." That was all. She blinked. She had expected more, a negotiation, a tearful scene, a capitulation disguised as compromise. She had prepared for a version of me that no longer existed. Uncle Raymond cleared his throat and asked my father about the football game. The conversation resumed. The pot roast was finished. My mother brought out a peach cobbler. I ate a full serving, complimented her on the crust, helped clear the table, and left at 8:15 with my coat folded over my arm and my bag on my shoulder. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. 2 days. Danny was inside that house at that table, already planning her second location, already scaling, already performing for an audience that had no idea the stage was about to collapse. I started the car and drove home through the October dark, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking up once. The follow-up meeting with Agent Caldwell was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. I arrived at 8:44. Marcus was already in the lobby, his briefcase on the chair beside him, a coffee in his hand. He stood when he saw me, looked at my face, and said, "You ready?" I said yes. He nodded once, and we went in. The conference room was the same one as before. Beige walls, fluorescent hum, a rectangular table that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. Agent Caldwell was already seated. There was a second agent with him this time, a woman named Agent Torres, who handled fraud classification. That detail was not lost on me. Marcus placed the evidentiary package on the table. Agent Caldwell opened it. The room was quiet. I want to tell you what 4 minutes and 22 seconds of silence sounds like in a government conference room while 2 federal agents read through a document that is about to change everything. It sounds like your own heartbeat. It sounds like the ventilation system cycling on. It sounds like the specific, irreversible turning of pages. Agent Torres looked up first. She asked me to confirm the date I had first become aware of Brooks Home & Co. I told her, the morning of my first meeting with Agent Caldwell. She wrote something down. She asked whether I had ever authorized anyone to use my EIN for a separate business entity. I said no. She wrote something else down. Agent Caldwell looked at the vendor correspondence, the emails from our Portland supplier, flagging the anomalous account. He looked at the editable access logs showing Danny's login history and the date I had expired her link. He looked at the trade show registration from Dallas. He looked at me and said, "Ms. Brooks, Based on the documentation provided, it is the position of this office that you are not the subject of this audit. You are the victim of unauthorized EIN usage. I had known this was coming. Marcus had prepared me for exactly this outcome. I had run the scenario in my head 100 times in the past 5 days. I still had to press my hands flat against my thighs under the table so they would stop shaking. The meeting lasted another 38 minutes. At the end of it, Agent Caldwell told me that Danielle Brooks would be receiving a formal audit notice of her own within the week. The $218,400 in unreported revenue would be subject to full back tax assessment. Because the filing involved deliberate misuse of another party's tax identification number, it would also be flagged for fraud penalty classification, an additional 75% civil fraud penalty on top of the unpaid tax. I did the math on the way out of the building. $218,400 in back taxes, plus 75%. The total liability was sitting somewhere north of $382,000. Danny did not have $382,000. Marcus and I stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building in the flat October light. He asked if I was all right. I said I thought so. He said the hard part was over. I said I knew. Then I called Danny. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. Her voice was careful, neutral, positioned for negotiation. She said, "Nat, how did it go?" I said, "The IRS has cleared my account. They'll be contacting you directly." A pause, long enough to mean something. Then, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." Her voice shifted. The careful neutrality cracked at the edges and something rawer came through. Not remorse, not yet, but the first real tremor of consequence. She said, "You could have just said we had an arrangement. One formality, that's all it would have taken. Why would you do this to me?" And there it was, the callback I had been carrying in my chest for 14 months without knowing it. Why would you do this to me? I said, "Danny, you told me I was hoarding connections. You said you just used what was technically available." I let that sit for exactly 1 second. The IRS uses the same logic. They just use what was technically documented. She didn't answer. I kept my voice level. I kept it quiet. I said, "Generosity doesn't keep records, but accounting does, and I kept records of everything." Another silence. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, with the particular fury of someone who has never faced a consequence they couldn't negotiate their way out of, "You know what? Fine. We're done. You're dead to me, Natalie. You're actually dead to me." I looked out at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into her car. The sky was still that flat October gray. My hands had stopped shaking. I said, "Danny, that's the first thing we've agreed on in a very long time." I hung up. Marcus was still standing beside me. He had heard enough from my side of the call to understand what had just happened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You good?" I thought about it genuinely, the way the question deserved. I said, "Yeah, I actually am." The IRS notice arrived at my parents' house on a Friday. I know this because my mother called me that same afternoon, not to apologize, not to ask how I was doing. She called to tell me that Danny was upset, that the letter had numbers on it that didn't make sense, and could I please recommend someone who could help. I told her I would text her Marcus Webb's office number. I texted it. I did not follow up. That was the last substantive conversation I had with my mother for 4 months. What followed for Danielle was not dramatic in the way people imagine consequences to be dramatic. There was no single moment of public collapse, no scene in a parking lot, no tearful confrontation. It was slower than that. It was administrative. It was a particular grinding misery of a problem that does not go away because you ignore it, that in fact grows larger and more specific the longer you wait. The IRS assessed the full $218,400 in back taxes. The fraud penalty classification added another $163,800 on top. Total liability, $307,200. Danielle had approximately $14,000 in her personal checking account and a lease on a retail space she could no longer afford to stock. Brooks Home & Co. closed its doors 6 weeks after the audit notice arrived. The landlord kept the security deposit. The remaining inventory, sourced from vendors she had accessed through my network, ordered on payment terms she had never intended to honor, was seized to partially offset outstanding invoices. One of those vendors, the Portland supplier I had worked with for 4 years, called me personally to let me know. He was apologetic. I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it. Danny sold her car in November, a 2022 Audi A4 she had bought 18 months earlier, during the period when Brooks Home & Co. was generating revenue she wasn't reporting. She moved back into my parents' house in Cedar Park before Thanksgiving. I found that out from my cousin, not from my parents. My father called me in December. He called on a Sunday evening, which was unusual. My father did not typically initiate calls. He asked how the business was going. I told him it was going well. He said that was good. There was a long pause, and then he said, "She's having a hard time, Nat." I said, "I know, Dad." He said she didn't understand what she was doing. Not really. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the 3 months of training, the vendor introductions, the system access, the $8,500, the 14 months of operation, the practice speech at the kitchen table about what was technically available, the plan to open a second location in the domain. I said I think she understood more than we're giving her credit for. He didn't respond to that. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular and then said goodbye. My mother called in February. Her voice was different, smaller, careful, stripped of the particular authority it usually carried. She said Danny was working with a tax resolution specialist, that they were trying to negotiate a payment plan, that it was going to take years. She said Danny wanted to talk to me. I said, "I'm not ready for that." She said, "Natalie, she's your sister." I said, "I know who she is, Mom." And then, because I had carried this sentence for a long time and it was finally the right moment to set it down, I said, "I spent my whole life making sure this family was okay. I covered the mortgage when Dad's hours got cut. I trained Danny for free. I lent her money I never asked back for. And when she used my tax ID to run a competing business for over a year, the first thing you said to me was that I was being selfish." I paused. "I'm not angry about it anymore, but I need you to understand that I remember it." My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know it was that serious." I said, "I know you didn't." I meant that too. In March, Brooks Atelier signed a new B2B contract with the boutique hotel group in San Antonio. 4 properties. Total contract value, $94,000 across 18 months with a renewal option. I hired a 3rd part-time employee to handle fulfillment logistics. I upgraded the Airtable system. I ordered new business cards that said only my name and my store's name, clean and simple, with nothing extra. I put them on my desk and looked at them for a moment before the workday started. Here is what I know now that I did not know then, or perhaps knew but could not yet articulate. Every time I covered for Danny, every time I absorbed the consequence she should have faced, every time I handed her a resource and asked nothing in return and said, "Of course," when my mother called and told me to be understanding, I was not being generous. I was participating in a system that taught her consequences were optional, that effort was for people like me, that the word family was a sufficient substitute for accountability. The most loving thing I ever did for my sister was the thing that felt the least like love. I did not rescue her. I did not negotiate. I did not sign a form that would have made a federal fraud problem disappear at my own expense. I let the consequence arrive on schedule as designed, and I stepped out of its way. Consequences are not cruelty. They are information. They are the mechanism by which the world communicates what is and is not acceptable, the feedback loop that someone had been shielding Danny from her entire life, and that I had been helping to short-circuit without realizing what I was doing. I am not her villain. I was never her safety net to begin with. I was just a person who finally stopped pretending otherwise. If your family has ever handed you a form and told you to sign it, if they've ever looked at something they built on your back and called it a favor, if they've ever stood in a warm kitchen that smelled like vanilla candles and told you that protecting yourself was the same as destroying them, You already know how this story feels. The question is whether you are still signing the form. If your family did this to you, would you forgive them or would you walk away? Let me know in the comments.